Okay, so let's talk about what's happening with the church during the Middle Ages. One of the most pivotal moments is the Great Schism. So this happens in 1054, and ultimately it is the division between the Christian church, division between Christendom. The Eastern Orthodox Church breaks off, and ultimately all of Russia, Ukraine, Greece, they are the followers of Eastern Orthodoxy. And then the Roman Catholic Church, which is centered in Rome, is obviously dominating Western Europe. So the churches never reconcile. We could certainly compare this to the Protestant Reformation, which we haven't yet talked about in this class. But if you've taken AP Euro or any European history class in the past, you might be familiar with that event. So this is a really major event in religious history that you should definitely be familiar with. And since we know in general Europe was on the decline during the medieval era, the Great Schism is a very good example proving that. Some of the reasons why the two churches split, one of the most important ones was what the Pope's actual role was supposed to be. So, in other words, the Eastern Orthodox Church felt that the Pope existed, but didn't necessarily feel that the Pope was the ultimate authority in the church. Whereas the Roman Catholic Church believes that the Pope is supreme. So that was a major issue. Another issue is iconoclasm, which we've discussed in the past, but just as a recap, that's the use of idols in art and other expressions of religiosity. So the Eastern Church does not want to use idols. The Western Church does, so that's another reason for their split. But the most significant part about the Great Schism that you should know is that these churches never rejoined. So still today, the Christendom that you see in Eastern Europe is much more likely to be Eastern Orthodox, right? Once you get past Hungary in particular, you're going to find mostly Eastern Orthodoxy. Whereas if you see Roman Catholicism, it's going to be in Western Europe. Much more complicated now after the Protestant Reformation. In any case, this series of videos is more focused on Western Europe. So after the Great Schism, we need to realize that the Roman Catholic Church was still a very authoritative body in Western Europe. In fact, since Western Europe was so politically decentralized during this period, the church was one of the main authorities that held Western Europe together. The church also kept its influence because the vast majority of the populace was illiterate. So, but the clergy, of course, was not. So they were able to exploit that since the average person working for the church could read and write and the average layperson could not. If you ever needed a contract signed, anything interpreted, you needed to appoint a clergy member to do that for you. And so basically the lack of knowledge is puts you at a huge disadvantage. So in a lot of ways the church exploited that low literacy for a long period of time. So you can only imagine how the Renaissance turns this authority system upside down. Once people have access to knowledge, they start to question the establishment, right? In any case, one of the reasons why most medieval art was religious in nature was to actually educate the layperson. Since they couldn't read, they would observe, they would look at art, and that was one of its major purposes. So it's important for us to remember that the majority of art in the medieval era in Europe, in Western Europe particularly, all the art is religious in nature. This is on purpose. It appeals to the masses. The people can't read, but they still are pious. The authority, the monarchs, the nobles want them to be religious, so they make beautiful things for them to look at, essentially, right? And make it easy for them to worship by having churches basically on every manor. And in turn, they can keep feudalism intact, right? So anyway, in terms of how art and education mix, it's important for us to realize that the earliest universities in Western Europe were highly influenced by the church. So, because of that, you see that most of the great thinkers of the medieval era were also leaders in the church. All medieval artists would work for the church. It was the church that was commissioning their art. The insides of church buildings were decorated with paintings and statues, stained glass windows, and all of them had religious themes. And like I said before, really the meaning is to educate the illiterate. All right, so again, just with this whole feudal system, it's important for us to realize that everything is intertwined, right? Religion plays just as much of a role in culture as it does in the government. So basically, the church's role in the feudal system was similar to that of a manor. In fact, monasteries essentially were their own self-sufficient economies, just like manors were. So if a lord displeased the Catholic Church, the church then could turn around and put pressure on the lord. So in some ways, monasteries or just the church's role in feudalism was stronger than that of nobles, because I guess you could say that the church had God on their side. But anyway, that was really lame. But the idea is that even though both monasteries and regular estates, regular fiefs, were major moneymakers and high status symbols, I would make the argument that because of the papal influence, monasteries were in a better position. The other problem with that is that if a church places a lot of pressure on a lord or denounces a lord, then the peasants can get even more upset with their lord if it was their lord that was just dishonoring the church, right? So peasants were incredibly religious people, and so if the church sort of said something against your lord and you were a peasant, you could get upset and a potential revolt could be on your hands. The church itself really fit well within the feudal system because the church also has a hierarchy. And the hierarchy, I don't think you'd ever need to know it to this level of detail on the AP exam, but here it is, right? Obviously, the Pope being at the top, cardinals next in line to the Pope, but I mean, I would say, you don't need to, this is like stuff that if you are getting confirmed, if you're really, never mind, you don't really need to know this level of detail. But the laity is always at the bottom. So ultimately, the average person is still a member of the church hierarchy, but they are the bottom. So they're the serfs, for lack of a better word, in the eyes of the church. So the donation of Constantine was a Roman document that provided the church with evidence that the Pope should assume political as well as spiritual authority. But later, this document turned out to be forged. But it still showed how the influence and power of the papacy was increasing, and this is sort of exemplified by what the Pope was doing. So, for example, various popes inspired members of the aristocracy in Europe to go to the Crusades. And they started in 1095, they continued until the 13th centuries. But the fact that the church played such a strong role in feudalism is crucial because the Crusades went on for over 200 years. And one of the reasons why so many men were willing to fight and die is because the church wanted them to. So that shows you how important religion is in the medieval era. But religion does experience many challenges in medieval Europe, so it's not as if everything is peachy for Christianity. One of the most trying moments of Christian history in the medieval era was the Avignon papacy, or some people also call it the Second Great Schism. We just talked about the other one previously. It's also referred to as the Babylonian captivity. So you might hear about it in many different ways, but all of those things are the same event. And so what happens here is that a French pope, Clement V, was selected. And he didn't want to move to Rome. So instead, the pope stayed in France, in Avignon, and the papacy actually remained in France from 1309 until 1377. So the reason why this is referred to as the Babylonian captivity, that's actually a reference to an event during the 6th century BCE an event of Jewish exile. So this is actually a biblical reference that the Christians were using. And during the period of the Avignon papacy rather, not only one but two other candidates for pope arose. So there, at one point, there were three different people claiming that they were pope. So basically, if you were living in Europe during this era, during the era of the Babylonian captivity, the Avignon papacy, whatever you want to call it, Second Great Schism, it was very chaotic. If you lived in France, you probably supported the Avignon Pope. If you lived somewhere else, if you lived closer to Rome, you would be more attached to Rome as the center of the church. So it was a very chaotic time, and it only further contributed to the problems in Western Europe. Not to mention that the Black Plague is happening, or it had it was breaking out in 1347 to 1351-ish. So that's happening at the same time. So, but let's stick within the church. We'll talk about the Black Death in a little bit. So the clergy remains part of the economies of Western Europe, even though it withdrew to monasteries to meditate and pray. Right? So monasteries we tend to think of as these isolated places where all the monks take vows of poverty and chastity. It's true, they do take these vows, but once they're there, the actual lifestyle, the monastery itself is a place of great wealth, right? They essentially function like independent manors, which I mentioned previously. So the point is that even though clergy members themselves were technically poor as individuals, they were working for very wealthy places. And also monasteries had considerable political influence as well. So not only were they wealthy places, their significance within the church allowed them to potentially put pressure on nobles, on the monarch. Right, so oftentimes there was church corruption as a result. They were ultimately getting too big for their britches. And so in the 11th century, a monastery in Cluny, France, instituted a series of reforms called the Cluniac Reforms, named after the city in France. It's also referred to as the Benedictine Reforms. So they're attempting to reform the church from within. So in many ways, we could actually compare this to a much later reform movement within the Catholic Church called the Counter-Reformation. So we haven't studied that yet in this class, but again, if you previously have taken European history, you might know that's basically during the Protestant Reformation. It's the Catholic Church's attempt to stop the spread of Protestantism and also win back followers to the Catholic Church. So it's similar. I would argue that the Cluniac reforms, though, are not nearly as large, but still, in France, the point is for them to sort of wield out the corruption that was generating in the Catholic Church because the church had so much power. So eventually, corruption as well as theological disagreements drive later reformers. John Wycliffe, Jan Hus, and Martin Luther, of course, also part ways with the Catholic Church. So the Cluniac reforms obviously don't result in anyone actually breaking off from the Catholic Church, so it's not huge like the Reformation, but you could say that it's sort of a foreshadowing to that. So by no means was the Catholic Church, again, in a good place during the medieval era. Then also later in the Middle Ages, you're going to see that some strong monarchies emerge. We're not yet in the absolute era by any means, but we see some periods of political centralization. We already talked about Charlemagne in the previous videos. So what this starts to do is it challenges the authority of the Pope. This also means that along with the strength of the monarchy, the bureaucracy tends to grow. That, of course, is because a strong king is going to need to have many government workers carrying out his various decisions. And also, along with that comes a strengthened military. So basically, these changes, when they occurred, for example, France, the Carolingian dynasty is an excellent example of this. You see that the church could undergo some challenges. But it's not just the Carolingian dynasty. This happens increasingly once we get closer to the Renaissance. Again, I think the Carolingian dynasty is almost an exception. But once we get more to the 15th century, after the Black Plague, after the crisis in the church, places like England, the rise of the Tudors after the 30 Years' War, right? That's a very good example of a monarchy actually challenging the papacy in terms of power. All right, so let's talk about what's happening in France after the Carolingian dynasty falls. So that splits in 987 CE, and the Western Franks, they choose a man named Hugh Capet as their king. So that's why this period of France is called Capetian France. It's named after Hugh Capet. And this is when we start to refer to this place as France, because it was also called the Kingdom of the French, or also was referred to as former Gaul, right? So there's still a nod back to the Roman times, but this is when we're really starting to see France form, right? In spite of the title, King Capet didn't really have power. He was still very much a figurehead. He leaves later kings, people like Philip II, who ruled in the 12th century, to develop the first real bureaucracy in France. Philip IV, who ruled in the late 13th and early 14th century, he was king when the first Estates General met in France. So this is a major change in terms of French politics. The Estates General was a legislative body to advise the king. So it included representatives from each of the three legal classes in France, or they were also called estates. The first estate, which was the clergy, the second estate, which was the nobility, and the third estate, which was everyone else, middle class, working class, everybody. This was the way that the French social hierarchy had been structured for a very long period, but the Estates General was a representative body meant to ultimately advise the king. The problem was that it wasn't very well balanced. The first and second estate were super small. Third estate was huge, right? But each estate had the same number of votes. So that's going to become a problem way later with the French Revolution. So in any case, the fact that the first Estates General meets is significant because first off, the king consulted the Estates General to raise taxes, for example. But the problem was that the regular first and second estate, the clergy and the nobility, did not regularly pay taxes. And the Estates General, in these early phases, really didn't have any power. It was sort of a very minor check on the king. The clergy and the nobility felt little responsibility to protect a government that they were not financing, right? So since the first and the second estate were not paying taxes, they didn't really care enough about funding other policies. And so the problem only increased in France up until the eve of the French Revolution, which is where things really get bad. So essentially you have these nobles making up 2/3 of the power of the Estates General and not really caring about the political future of France. So that's very problematic. In any case, let's talk about the Holy Roman Empire after a break, because I feel like this has been going on for a bit. So stay tuned and thanks.